Hello and welcome to Chapter 6 of our FSPCA curriculum on preventive controls for animal food. In this chapter, we are going to tackle the management components required for preventive controls. So just to kind of reorient ourselves to where we're at in this whole food safety plan process, we started by identifying some of our known or reasonably foreseeable hazards that could possibly happen given our intended species and our manufacturing processes. And then we evaluated each of those hazards using the hazard analysis process, and we evaluated them for both severity and probability. And then based on those evaluations, we said, yes, this does need a preventive control, or no, it does not. So at this point, we are assuming that we said yes to at least one of those hazards, and now we're going to take a look at how we're going to control the preventive control that we, or I guess manage the preventive control that we decided to establish based on that evaluation. So here are the objectives for this chapter. We're going to learn all about management components, and those three management components that we're going to talk about are monitoring, corrective actions and corrections, and verification. And you can kind of see here, we're going to explore verification quite a bit, but you can already see that the word validation appears under the word verification. So if you have training in HACCP or familiar with HACCP programs, this validation verification conversation might be a little bit confusing for you, but I'm going to do my best to kind of break down what validation and what verification are under this rule, and then also talk about how verification of implementation and effectiveness plays into that conversation. Okay, so keep in mind these three bullet points. We're going to be revisiting all three of these throughout this chapter and throughout chapters 7, 8, and 9. Now at this point, I just want to remind you that you do have the entire rule written out in your appendix number 1. And in this chapter, we are going to be going over a lot of the regulatory text. So it may be helpful just to follow along in chapter 1 or flip back and forth between your slides in your manual and the chapter or the appendix 1, the actual rule in the back of your book. So here's the actual regulation on the management components. This is 507.39. And here Part A tells us, except as provided by paragraphs B and C of this section, the preventive controls required under 507.34 are subject to the following preventive control management components as appropriate to ensure the effectiveness of the preventive controls, taking into account the nature of the preventive control and its role in the facility's food safety system. Monitoring, corrective actions and corrections, and verification. Okay, so what this is saying is that if we decided we needed a preventive control, we need to have these three management components in place to make sure that the preventive controls are actually effective. And of course, these are only going to be designed as and implemented as appropriate to the facility's food safety system. And when we're talking about a supply chain applied control, which is going to be a little bit different situation, we need a little bit different management components. So in Chapter 9, we're going to go over Subpart E, which is the supply chain programs. And this is a method of controlling a hazard, which is similar to a preventive control. But because the logistics are a little bit different, it gets its own subpart and it needs a little bit different management components. We'll still have some corrective actions and corrections in place, but we're going to be doing a lot more review of records, and then of course we'll also have the reanalysis piece built into that part of our food safety plan as well. The recall plan is not subject to any of these management components. It's kind of a separate thing within the food safety plan that doesn't need to go through corrective actions and corrections. It'll have its own kind of built-in components there. This is a graphic that we are going to see a lot throughout these next couple of chapters. What this does for us is that across the top it breaks down all of the 3 different types of preventive controls that are addressed in this regulation. And that's going to be a process control, a sanitation control, and a supply chain applied control. And we have another 4th category over there for anything that doesn't fit nicely into these categories in case that situation comes up. But then across the side, in the rows, we have those 3 different management components that are mentioned in the regulation. We've got monitoring there up top, corrective actions and corrections, and then verification has been split into 2 components, validation and then the rest of verification. That'd be monitoring, corrective actions, and implementation and effectiveness. And that's mostly because validation just is very different than those other types of verification. So, and then the green check marks tell us which ones are required for each of these sections. Now, as we go through these, I'm going to mention some times where I think it might be recommended to have these components, but this regulation just says that these are the ones that are required for each of these types of controls. Secondarily, we've already talked about reanalysis, and just keep in mind that reanalysis is a management component or is considered a management component, but it applies to all of these different controls, all these different situations where we said that reanalysis is required every 3 years or when something changes or when it's necessary. Okay, so keep reanalysis in the back of your mind as a requirement, but we're going to focus on these 3 other management components in these next couple of chapters. Here's a definition of monitor. So we're going to talk about monitoring first. Monitoring is a required management component. So what it means to monitor is to conduct a planned sequence of observations or measurements to assess whether control measures are operating as intended. So monitoring is something that we can observe or measure. We're getting data on something like this. We have a planned sequence. We have a planned structure that we use to monitor our preventive controls just to make sure that they are being done and implemented and operating as intended. So one really helpful thing that we can use to help monitor our preventive controls are parameter values. And a parameter value is a number or a data set, something that we can use to help guide our monitoring process. And so an example I kind of think of when I think of parameter values are going to be things like time, temperature controls, pH, water activity. Those are all things that will have set numbers where it says I have to reach that to know that my hazard has been controlled or significantly minimized. Okay, so this is an actual number that we can hit to control our biological, chemical, or physical hazards. This is usually going to be associated with process controls, and we'll talk about process controls in a lot more detail in the coming slides and chapters, but those are usually parts of our manufacturing processes that we incorporate into our food safety system to significantly minimize or prevent hazards. So if we give a parameter value, this is going to be an actual number we can look for and monitor and hit within our process control. Keep in mind that these are just safety associated. These are going to be different than operating limits that we're going to talk about a little bit later. Also, we kind of use the term parameter value in a very casual way. However, under this regulation and within the context of our food safety system, a parameter value is safety associated. So all of your qualified individuals or anyone that is doing monitoring of a preventive control for you, or even outside of a preventive control, anyone involved in the manufacturing process should be educated on the fact that the term parameter value indicates a preventive control and is strictly safety associated. Operating values, critical values, those are a little bit different, but parameter values are a safety associated term. So here's the actual regulation on monitoring. We already saw the definition, but 507.40 talks about monitoring as a management component. So what this says is that as appropriate to ensure the nature of the preventive control and its role in the facility's food safety system, you must A. Establish and implement written procedures, including the frequency with which they are to be performed for monitoring the preventive controls, and B. Monitor the preventive controls with adequate frequency to provide assurance that they are consistently performed. So if you have a preventive control that requires monitoring, you need to make sure you write that down. What does it actually look like to monitor this preventive control? And make some smart decisions about how often you should be doing that monitoring. The monitoring, the frequency needs to be appropriate for the preventive control and the level of risk that you're dealing with as well. Keep in mind this is only required for process and sanitation controls, and we'll talk about why that is and why they're not applied to supply chain controls when we get there, but you need to have monitoring written down in place and have an adequate frequency for any process or sanitation control. This 507.40 section also says that if you are doing a monitoring activity, you need to make some records to support that, or to record that you are doing that monitoring and meeting those parameter values or whatever constraints you have put on your preventive control. So this is going to be one of the main record generating activities that we do within our food safety system. Every time we're monitoring a preventive control, we're gonna write it down. And then also reviewing the records that are produced through monitoring is going to be one of the most effective ways to verify our preventive control management, or just verify our preventive control. Okay, so keep that in mind. Also, we have another kind of subsection here that says if we have records of temperature that's used in refrigeration, and we're doing that refrigeration to control the growth of a biological pathogen or to reduce toxin production by pathogens, those can be affirmative records or exception records. And an exception record is a record that is produced only when you go outside of your parameter values. So we don't need to be generating records that my refrigerator was within my parameter temperature for 24/7 for the last 3 months. I can choose to use exception records that says my refrigeration temperature went outside of my parameter values in this 30-second time period within the last 3 months. Okay, so it produces a record, it sets off some sort of alarm that says we went outside of our parameter values. That is an exception record. And while it's specifically mentioned as appropriate for refrigeration temperature, there are other situations that we could use exception records for. I think, for example, like an X-ray monitoring system that only produces a record when a foreign object is actually detected. It doesn't produce a record that every batch doesn't have foreign objects, just when it does actually catch one. So I've spoken to a lot of companies that use exception records, and I think they're a very smart way to be able to monitor your preventive controls. However, I have run across a few companies that have exception records, but it's only like an alarm system and doesn't necessarily produce a record. So ideally, we'll have a digital system in place where the whatever action needs to be taken when you go outside that parameter value happens, for example, like stopping a line. And also it produces a record that you went outside of those parameter values and sets off an alarm to notify whoever's in charge or whoever needs to take care of that, that you went outside of those parameters. Okay, so if you don't have that recording system already in place and maybe you just have the alarm system, you need to make sure there's a procedure in place to create a record or write down that we went outside of those parameter values. So you have some record to go along with that monitoring component, even if it is an exception record. Okay, here's an example of a description of a preventive control. So ideally, this will be in the part of your food safety plan that says preventive controls, and it will talk about each of your preventive control procedures and all of the management components associated with that. So up top, we have the first couple of sections that talk about the purpose, the frequency, who's doing it, and then the actual step-by-step procedure. Below that, we have all of the management components associated with this preventive control. And you'll notice that goes right along with the regulation that we have the monitoring, the corrective actions, and the verification written down and described within this single sheet of paper that gives a snapshot of our preventive control. Now, we are going to be using this preventive control as an example for the rest of the curriculum. So I want to just read through this really quickly so you guys can get a feel for what this preventive control actually is. Now, again, we are in ABC feed mill, and remember the control that we're working with in this example, or the hazard that we're working with in this example, is copper toxicity in sheep. So we decided through our hazard analysis process that one of the things that we're going to be doing is to have a procedure for batching and mixing. Okay, and that's what we're looking at here. This is preventive control number 2. You'll also notice that it's associated with a SOP 200.6. So it's likely that this feed mill already had an SOP in place for this exact procedure, and now they're just reworking it to make it look more like what FSMA is asking for. Okay, so let's read through this procedure. Prior to manufacturing feed, we are checking scales to make sure they're zeroed and checking the mixer to make sure it is empty per the scale readout. Confirm the feed to be manufactured is appropriate based on the sequencing plan. So for example, prior to manufacturing sheep feed, a complete feed that does not contain high copper premix must be manufactured, and a flush must be run prior to batching. So already some just like good standard practices for checking to make sure everything's in place before we even start batching and mixing our feed. Confirm the formula to be batched is accurate based on the master record formula. And then we can start our mixing process. Weigh all ingredients during batching, document, record lot numbers where appropriate, mix for 90 seconds dry mix and 120 seconds wet mix for a total time of 210 seconds, discharge the mixer to the correct finished feed bin, follow appropriate sequencing. Okay, great. Now I can hand this to any batch operator and they'll know the exact sequence of events to do to make sure that they're producing safe feed. Now let's take a look at the monitoring, since that's kind of what we've been talking about so far in this chapter. How do I monitor that this preventive control is actually taking place? Well, first, the quantity of the ingredient was weighed during the batching of each run. Okay, I'm going to write down the quantity of each ingredient weighed. I'm also going to do a daily reconciliation of some of the more important ingredients, or I guess some of the more high-risk ingredients. So remember that we actually have multiple premixes being used within this facility, and mixing up those premixes could have some serious consequences. So at the end of every day, I'm going to do a reconciliation of just the sheep mineral premix, the beef mineral premix, the swine mineral premix, and the copper sulfate, because all of those could potentially introduce too much copper into my sheep premix. Okay, we're going to come back to this example a little bit later, but I hope that gives you an idea of what this process is and then how I can monitor a process like this. Let's take a look at an example of some of the records created through that monitoring process. So this is a batching record produced through this preventive control. So this is when I'm actually mixing the feed. So on the left-hand side, I have all of the ingredients that are going into the feed. This is the amount required per the master formula. And then as I weigh them out and add them, I'm going to write that number right in here and where I got them from, so all of the lot numbers. And then right here, according to our records section, having initials or names on records produced is an important component. So our batch operator, his name is Chad Smith, CS, is going to initial that he was the one that weighed out and added all of these ingredients to this particular batch. Okay? And then at the end here we have, we're going to come back to this idea a little bit later also, but this is the PCQI that reviews these records as part of a verification activity. Okay, so an example of a monitoring record that's going to be produced through monitoring a preventive control. We had a second piece here of reconciling our most important ingredients, which is great, but I think to make this a little bit better, I'm also going to create an SOP that goes through that reconciliation process to make sure that it's done correctly. Because we're talking about such a high risk situation, I want to make sure this part is done correctly also. So you'll see this is SOP 200.9, but it's still associated with preventive control number 2. So we had an SOP that showed us how to batch and mix, and we have an SOP that shows us one of the monitoring procedures, which is a reconciliation. Okay, so this is just an example. You should coordinate these things and create these things to make sure it works for whatever your facility, and kind of incorporates what you already have in place as well. So let's take a look at this procedure. Again, we have the purpose, frequency, and who's doing it. The procedure, well, throughout the day, I'm recording lot numbers and how much ingredients was used. And then as I can throughout the day, I'm going to evaluate discrepancies and investigate where appropriate. Then here's the big one. At the end of the day, we're going to calculate the total quantity of all designated ingredients used, sold, spilled, or otherwise disposed of throughout the day. This is called the theoretical use. This is how much I think I used or spilled or sold throughout the day. Then I'm also going to conduct an inventory of all designated ingredients, regardless if they were used that day. So even if I'm not making swine feed that day, I'm still going to conduct an inventory of my swine mineral premix every day. This is called the actual use. So we have what I think I used and what's actually missing. Then I'm going to compare those two different things and see what the percent deviation is between them. So what's the difference here? If I use this much and I think I use this much, how much is missing based on those numbers? And then take a look at this. We have a parameter value that's established as to go along with that, to help with the monitoring of this preventive control. So through the reconciliation, I'm going to compare the theoretical use versus actual use deviation, and it can't be more than 10% deviation. So I have a parameter, I have a number to hit that says that this preventive control is being done correctly and my hazard is being controlled. Okay? Let's take a look at the record that might be produced through this whole process. So here we have the reconciliation record. Again, I'm doing this at the end of every day. And as described in the first SOP we looked at, I am going to do a daily reconciliation of these special ingredients, the cattle premix, the swine premix, the sheep premix, and copper sulfate. Remember those kind of higher risk ingredients. So here's the lot numbers that I was working with either that day or this, what's on hand right now that could be pulled out of. At the beginning of the day, I started with this much. At the end of the day, I had this much. So simple weighing at the beginning of the day, weighing at the end of the day. Well, it looks like cattle, we didn't make any cattle feed today, so what we actually used was 0. And then I'm going to go check Chad Smith's records and see if he thinks he used any cattle mineral premix. And he said nope. He didn't use any cattle mineral premix today, and then I'm going to calculate the deviation, which was 0%. Not a very exciting example, but if we take a look at our sheep mineral premix, remember we're most concerned about our sheep premix. So what I started with here, what I ended with here, so I actually used 31 pounds throughout the day. Well, Chad Smith only wrote down that he used 30 pounds. Uh-oh, that may be a red flag. But if we do the percent deviation, what we find out is that we're under that 10%. That's only a 3.3% deviation, and so we're within that 10% parameter value. No red flag, we're good to go, we're still making safe feed. Okay, so just another record produced through the monitoring procedure. So now that we've gone over what monitoring is and some examples of some monitoring activities, let's talk about corrective actions and corrections. So here's the regulation on corrective actions and corrections. It's 507.42. I think this part gets a little bit confusing and a little bit redundant, so I'll do my best to kind of break this down and help orient you to this piece of the regulation. So first, part A. As appropriate to the nature of the hazard and the nature of the preventive control, except as provided by Part C or Paragraph C of this section, you must establish and implement written corrective action procedures that must be taken if preventive controls are not properly implemented, including procedures to address, as appropriate, the presence of a pathogen or appropriate indicator organism in animal food detected as a result of product testing conducted in accordance with 507.49, and the presence of an environmental pathogen or appropriate indicator organism detected through the environmental monitoring conducted in accordance with 507.49. Okay, so if we have to do corrective actions, then we need to write those down and make sure we have a written out, established plan for corrective action procedures. So what do I need to include in my corrective action plan? These 4 steps right here. So the corrective action procedures must describe the steps to be taken to ensure that appropriate action is taken to identify and correct a problem that has occurred with implementation of a preventive control. An appropriate action is taken when necessary to reduce the likelihood that the problem will recur. All affected animal food is evaluated for safety, and all affected animal food is prevented from entering commerce if you cannot ensure the effective animal food is not adulterated under Section 402 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Okay, so we need to establish written procedures. They need to include these 4 actions. And we're actually going to see these 4 bullet points quite a bit in the next couple of chapters. I kind of like to summarize them as 1, identifying and correct the problem, 2, reduce the likelihood of it reoccurring, 3, evaluate all affected food, and 4, prevent from entering commerce. Okay? How do I know when I actually do need to implement this corrective action procedure? Well, except as provided by paragraph C, you are subject to the requirements of the corrective action plan if any of the following circumstances happen. A preventive control is not properly implemented and a corrective action plan has not been established. A preventive control, combination of preventive controls, or the food safety plan as a whole is found to be ineffective, or a review of records in accordance with our records review section finds that the records are not complete, the activities conducted did not occur in accordance with the food safety plan, or appropriate decisions were not made about the corrective action. So what that section is saying is that some of the records produced through corrective actions can be reviewed as we are going to see in our verification section. And through that review, we're going to say, did this happen correctly? Did this get written down correctly? And if not, then we need to go back and do some other corrective action as well. Okay, or if our preventive control is just not being properly implemented. Okay, so that tells us when we need to implement a corrective action. Here's what we need to do when we actually implement that corrective action. This should look familiar. What we need to do is take corrective action to identify and correct the problem, reduce the likelihood, evaluate all affected animal food, prevent it from entering commerce, and then take a look at number 5. When appropriate, reanalyze the food safety plan in accordance with 507.50, which is our reanalysis section, to determine whether modification of the food safety plan is required. Okay, so all of the subparts of this 507.42 says if we're subject to corrective actions, we need to write those things down and have a plan. We have 4 bullet points that we need to have in that plan. We have some guidelines of when we need to take corrective actions, and this section tells us what we need to do when we are taking corrective action. And luckily, 4 of these are already in our written plan, and then the 5th one we know already because of the reanalysis section says that we need to reanalyze when something changes or as it's appropriate. So a corrective action could be something that happens that kind of triggers that, oh no, we need to reanalyze what we're doing here and make sure it's still appropriate for the hazards and for our manufacturing processes. Okay? In addition to corrective action, if this adulterated product does leave your facility and go out into commerce, then you're also going to have to conduct a recall plan in addition to these corrective actions. And we'll talk about recalls in more detail in chapter 10, but keep in mind how those two things kind of interact with each other. So here's an example of a situation where we might need to take a corrective action. Okay, so luckily Chad Smith is creating batch records throughout the day because he's following our SOP, but he didn't follow the complete procedure, which includes weighing out and adding the correct amount of ingredients. So take a look at this. So he was supposed to add 30 pounds of sheep mineral premix, and he actually added 60 pounds of sheep mineral premix. Okay, there's a red flag there. Something's going wrong. We know sheep mineral premix has copper in it. So this food is going to be considered adulterated because it has too much copper. When we take a look at a reconciliation record, we can also see some red flags that could go up that tell us that a corrective action needs to happen. This one gets a little bit more tricky, and we can kind of piece the puzzle together through all of this information. So take a look at all the information that is circled in red. If I take a look at my sheep mineral premix, what Chad Smith thought he used that day was 25 pounds. What he actually used was only 15 pounds. Okay, so if I do that percent deviation, what I come up with is 66.6, which is way more than my 10% parameter. So obviously this food is not meeting our specs, it's not meeting our parameter values, it's considered adulterated. However, because I've taken the steps to do this reconciliation record, I can kind of start to figure out what went wrong and how to reduce the likelihood of it occurring in the future. If we take a look at our swine mineral premix, take a look at these numbers. What Chad Smith thought he used that day was 15 pounds, but what he actually used was 25 pounds. Okay, so I can make an assumption based on those numbers that Chad Smith may have grabbed the swine mineral premix when he thought he was grabbing the sheep mineral premix. Okay, so at some point he got those bags mixed up throughout the day, and now our percent deviation on our swine mineral premix is 40%, and Chad Smith has definitely made adulterated food there by putting too much swine mineral premix into our sheep feed. Okay, so just another example of a record, a monitoring record that could be used as an indicator that corrective action needs to take place. Here's part C of the 507.42 on corrective actions and corrections. You do not need to comply with corrective actions and corrections if you take action in a timely manner to identify and correct the conditions and practices that are not consistent with sanitation controls, or you take action in a timely manner to identify and correct a minor and isolated problem that does not directly impact product safety. Okay, so I kind of like to consider this part of the regulation the quote-unquote correction paragraph. I'm not sure why these two weren't teased out, the difference between corrective action and correction, but this is kind of embedded into the corrective action section. But this part C is talking about what we consider to be a correction. A correction is a situation where we can identify and correct a problem without having to do all of the other steps and all of the other paperwork. And this only applies to situations that are minor and isolated, or something that happens when sanitation controls are not quite implemented correctly. But again, that's something that you're doing in a timely manner and you're still identifying and correcting the problem. Okay, we'll dive more into that example into chapter 8, but just know that if something small gets messed up one time, that doesn't mean we have to go through the corrective action procedures. We can identify and correct the problem, fix it, and go on with our lives. We don't have to write to FDA every time that something does go wrong. So this is kind of what we consider a correction, and we'll take a look at a definition of correction and explore this idea a little bit more in chapter 8. But the last part of this says that all corrective actions and when appropriate corrections taken must be documented in records. Okay, anytime we do something, anytime we make a product that goes outside our parameter values, we need to write it down and make a record of it. And then again, just like monitoring, those records can be reviewed as part of our verification process. So here's the definition of a correction that goes with part C of that section. An action to identify and correct a problem that occurred during the production of animal food without other actions associated with a corrective action procedure, such as actions to reduce the likelihood that the problem will occur, evaluate all affected animal food for safety, and prevent affected food from entering commerce. Okay, so this is kind of like describing a less serious situation, something that's minor and isolated, where we can still identify and correct a problem and start producing safe animal food again. So at this point, this is normally where we would do exercise 6, which is going to go into the management components of preventive controls and how to document those things. This exercise will be built into one of your assignments for this online course, but you can take a look at these questions now, kind of reflect on them, and start thinking about how you would design and record monitoring procedures and corrective action procedures. The summary of that exercise has these 3 bullet points. There are specific regulatory requirements that must be completed when managing preventive controls, and we just looked at all of those regulatory requirements, but there is some flexibility in how to apply preventive control management components. Facilities may choose different methods with varying frequency when monitoring and may have different approaches in corrections or corrective action activities. Many records are required to document the preventive control management components to demonstrate the food safety plan is working as intended.